As soon as you encounter uncertainty about how the world works or about how to live, and you might encounter uncertainty about those questions on the grounds of disagreement. As soon as you encounter disagreement about how the world works or how to live, then you now need to figure out how best to pursue understanding, how best to settle those disagreements, how best to gain certainty where once you were uncertain.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Stephen Toboroff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toboroff, and I'm very much looking forward to my conversation today because it's going to explore a number of areas that I think are extremely important for business, for entrepreneurship, but perhaps much more importantly for life itself. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest, which is Eric Brown. Professor Brown is an associate professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Brown researches and teaches mainly in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and in ethics, with special interest in how ancient Greek practical philosophy can inform us. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
My pleasure, Stephen.
So, before we jump in, if you wouldn't mind, I would love it if you could sort of give us a little background on yourself and how it was that you came to study philosophy and then really ancient Greek and Roman philosophy in particular within that sort of broader category.
Sure. I think I was a nerdy kid that liked to read. And so I looked into the possibility of finding a life where I did a lot of reading in it, and being a teacher seemed like a life where I would get to do a lot of reading and think. In college, I just came to think that the text that I most enjoyed reading and thinking about and the questions I most enjoyed thinking about were philosophical texts, philosophical questions, which of course presents a certain puzzle because there aren't as many teaching jobs for philosophers as there are for, say, historians. We don't often have, say, philosophy classes in high schools. So I thought, well, now I need to go to graduate school. So I went to graduate school. And it was really in graduate school that I came to think that the philosophical questions I was most interested in, questions about how we should live, that the texts that I thought were most promising in dealing with those questions were ancient Greek texts. I thought they were more promising than most of the recent philosophical literature in English, say. So I started reading more and more ancient Greek philosophy. And that's how I came to do what I do. It's mainly a series of happy accidents that have allowed me to do what I wanted to do.
You know, speaking of happy accidents, I think our audience might find it interesting that when I had made the decision to do a podcast centered around philosophy, I reached out to my alma mater and someone in the philosophy department and mentioned that I had an interest in Stoicism. And lo and behold, the person whom I reached out to said, I've got the perfect person for you. And in fact, this person went to University of Chicago the same time that you did. And then I learned that you and I lived in the same dorm, although in different houses. So, and I was a literature major, so it really is quite a happy coincidence, but I figured I would share that with the audience. I know we were in Burton Judson, which is the name of the dorm, at the same time. We must have bumped into each other, but I don't want to age us. It's so far back, I can't remember any incident, but it was a really lovely, happy coincidence there that I did want to share. So what I would love, Professor, is that Stoic philosophy has gotten quite a bit of attention in popular culture due to Ryan Holiday and others. As I've come to read about it myself, I don't think the way that it's being presented is perhaps as comprehensive or as helpful or as instructive as it might be. So I would love if we could begin, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your thought, your definition of what is Stoic philosophy and what is Stoicism? What is it that makes that school of philosophical thought unique and distinct?
That is a great question, and because it opens up questions, well, how do we think about what it is to be a philosopher at all? And then how, once we're philosophers, do we distinguish between different schools of philosophy? I think the best way to approach this is to start from the 4th century before the Common Era. So this is the century that basically starts with Socrates being executed in 399. And The fourth century is filled with literature about Socrates and filled with other literature that pretends to represent what it is to be a philosopher, that recommends being a philosopher. And this is all pretty new. There's no mention of being a philosopher as a special way of life that you should want to cultivate before the fourth century. And the biggest school of the new philosophy to be established was Plato's Academy. And in the Academy, they came to a kind of consensus about what it is the philosopher has to know in order to be wise. So you're pursuing wisdom as a philosopher, and what is it to be wise? Well, to be wise is, on the one hand, just think about the old people of old who were thought of as wise. On the one hand, they have a kind of understanding about the way the world works. They have an understanding of the natural world. They see things in the world, they can explain things in the world that others cannot. And that marks them as wise. Or they are especially perceptive about how to live. They seem to live an especially good life, and they seem to be able to give good advice about how to live. So the first kind of expertise, the understanding of how the world works, these Greeks called it physique, expertise about physis, nature. The second kind of expertise, the expertise about how to live, they called ethike, expertise about character, habit. And the thought is those are the basic kinds of wisdom that you could go after. But that doesn't yet mark philosophy as a distinctive way of life, because, of course, there can be people who seem and indeed are wise about how to live who aren't distinctively philosophical. Maybe they've just been well raised and learned well from experience. There's religious traditions that give us guidance about how to live, and some of those might embody a kind of wisdom without obviously being philosophical. But the Academy also hatches this thought, which is that, well, as soon as you encounter uncertainty about how the world works or about how to live, and you might encounter uncertainty about those questions on the grounds of disagreement. As soon as you encounter disagreement about how the world works or how to live, then you now need to figure out how best to pursue understanding, how best to settle those disagreements, how best to gain certainty where once you were uncertain. And that project, trying to understand understanding, understand how to pursue understanding, they called that logike. That's the expertise about logos, where logos is anything we say and anything we convey by saying, and our power to convey thoughts by words. So it's reason and language. That's logos. So expertise about that is needed also if you're going to be a philosopher. So they thought of these three different branches of philosophy: physique, ethike, logike, how the world works, how to live, and how to pursue understanding. That's a basic way of thinking about what philosophy is that emerges in the fourth century, and it became quite dominant in the Greek-speaking world. Now, with that in hand, we can distinguish different schools of philosophy based on their main answers to those questions. So, for example, we can draw a distinction when we think about how the world works between those philosophers who think the world is basically atomistic. It is composed of little atoms that can't be cut, that are separated from each other by void, empty space, and everything there is made of atoms and void. That's an answer that gets articulated by Democritus, and it gets picked up by the Epicureans. But the Stoics have a very different understanding about how the world works. And their understanding is more continuous with Plato and Aristotle. So there are no atoms. There is no void within the world in which we live. Rather, everything is continuous. It's filled with stuff. Some of that stuff is more dense and some of it is more rare, but it's stuff. They think that stuff is well ordered. Epicurus, the atomist, thinks that the world is random, whereas the Stoics think, no, it's perfectly well ordered. And of course, evidence A for that is going to be looking at the heavens and the stars in the sky, that sort of thing. So if you think about their conception of nature, it's that we live in a well-ordered cosmos is fundamental to the Stoic worldview. That doesn't make them completely distinctive, but it does distinguish them from, say, the Epicureans. When we think about ethics, distinctive thought here is you have to live in accordance with nature and seek a completely coherent, harmonious soul. And that is what it is to live well. Epicurus thinks to live well is to live with an absence of pain. The Stoics think, that's not it. It's to live coherently. They have things to say about logic as well, but by the time we get to some of the later authors that I think many of your listeners might be most fond of as Stoics, like, say, Epictetus or Marcus, they don't talk a lot about logic. And indeed, they don't even talk that much about physics, about the way the world is. They're focused on ethics. They're focused on giving advice to people about how to live coherently and in accordance with nature. So that's the sort of distinctive Stoic line.
Well, that was a great lead to my next question. But before I jump into that, you said something that I want to repeat, which was with respect to philosophy, gain certainty where you were uncertain. And that is something that is so important in the realm of being a business leader or an entrepreneur as well, which is why, I used to always tell people when they'd ask me if being a literature major, I went on to get a law degree, but if studying literature had served me well in business. And I always said, yes, it has, because as a literature student, you have to sort of analyze a text, make sense of it yourself, and defend sort of your understandings. But I think philosophy is even better in that regard. So I really liked what you said there, and I did want to underscore that for the audience. Now, you had mentioned Marcus Aurelius, which led me to my next question, because I, like many others who have come to become interested in Stoicism, my first foray into it was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which I really loved. And then after that, I did read Epictetus and his discourses, which I perhaps loved even more. And so my question for you, Professor, is in what ways, if any, would you distinguish the writing and the thinking of Epictetus from Aurelius? Are there any clear distinguishing characteristics, or do you view them as both just being excellently wise individuals, giving us the wisdom of Stoicism in a slightly different way?
That's a tremendously good question. I think there are some interesting little details that are different about the two. But I'll start. I think that fundamentally they're in agreement that Marcus clearly is following Epictetus in some regards. Indeed, the Epictetus at a couple of points gives the advice that you should meditate daily and write things down as reminders to yourself. And you could see the meditations that we have from Marcus as him following that advice. But that does point up one big difference between the text that we have, the text of Epictetus, whether he wrote it or whether it was written by his pupil, Arian, that kind of dictated it to him, and the text of Marcus Aurelius. They are different in the following way, and that is Epictetus seems to be giving advice to others, whereas Marcus is, at least in many of the passages, directing advice to himself. That traditional title of it looks like it's not, it looks like it's apt. And that really makes it an unusual text. We don't have a lot of other texts from the ancient world where the author addresses themselves like that. So that's a big difference. Another difference is that it looks like Epictetus's work is often set in a school context, and Marcus's is not. At least some of bits of the Meditations look like he's in his tent on a military campaign. So he's not in a school context at all. It's a very different kind of location to be, different set of concerns that might be in the back of his mind. So that's the difference. And then if we start to think about the kinds of commitments that mark Stoics and Stoics and say, are there any differences between Epictetus and Marcus? I mean, I think there are a few subtle differences. People have wondered about Marcus's commitment to the Stoic line about the cosmos being well ordered, because at several points in Meditations, he'll do this kind of trope where he'll say, well, whether atoms or providence, the following is the case. So whether Epicurus is right that the world is set up without providence, without order, that's to our benefit, but it's just random, or if the world is providentially well ordered for us, either way, it doesn't matter. I'm going to assert the following as being the case. And people wondered, does that mean that he's not fully committed to the Stoic line. I think he is fully committed to the Stoic line, but it is an interesting fact that he plays that rhetorical game with himself. It looks like for him, the physics is not really what matters. What matters is to remind himself of some ethical truth that he sometimes finds it difficult to stand by.
For myself, I'm glad that I read Meditations first because, as I say, it was one of those books that really sort of had a profound impact on me. But then in reading Epictetus, there were two, out of many things that I really enjoyed about it, there were two that I particularly enjoyed. The first, which I'm going to discuss with you a bit later, is his references of Socrates and how he holds Socrates up as the embodiment of a philosopher, and it's what inspired me to read Plato. But the second is Epictetus, to me, is someone who's really extolling, or these may have been dictated, but the writings of Epictetus, we'll call it that, really extol the individual to embody the fact that they're a philosopher rather than demonstrate it through seemingly erudite words or the ability to do syllogisms. And that, I think, was so fantastic. And it leads me to my next question for you, which is, within that context, for people who are looking to embody Stoicism in the manner that Epictetus talks about it, what would you say are some of the core lessons or attributes or components that Epictetus is focusing on that one should embody?
That's excellent. So I think the main thought for Epictetus, the one that he leads with, is this thought that you need to distinguish between what's up to you and what's not up to you. So much of what happens that you might care about, you have no control over. Whereas other things that you care about, you do have control over. And he encourages you to prioritize the things that you have control over. And then to do that, you need to develop a kind of discipline of desire. You need to be able to habituate your desires so that they match the priorities that you see as the appropriate priorities to have. So it's one thing to tell yourself, look, I shouldn't care about these things that I can't control as much as the things that I do control. But it's another thing to actually not care as much about the things you can't control. Right? That takes work. And then third, he's very clear that we have to work hard to train ourselves to how we see the world, how we see things, the impressions we form of the world, and then whether we accept those impressions. And so, for example, you might see someone as enviable, as admirable, but that might depend upon your over-exaggerating the importance of things that are not up to human beings, like their good fortune, their external good fortune that gives them lots of money or whatever. And he says, well, look, if you're really going to live well, you've got to set the right priorities. You've got to make your desires conform to those priorities. And then you've got to start seeing the world in accordance with those priorities, which requires that you not accept your initial impression of things. Right? You might think, oh, Kim Kardashian, what a wonderful life she's got. You've got to stop thinking of it in those terms.
Absolutely. And, a couple of things you said I want to go a little deeper on and these were things that I also identified in Epictetus and really found extraordinarily valuable. When you talk about identifying those things that you can and cannot control, that is so important for a leader in business to do, because in any given moment, there are so many different stimuli that can impact any decision you make or any objective or initiative you're looking to successfully complete. But the reality is that you can only impact that which is in your control. And reflecting on the way that Epictetus describes this and talks about it is, I think, incredibly valuable, again, for people in positions of responsibility in business. And of course, these all go for life as well, but I'm trying to distill this in a deeper way than perhaps other pop representations of Stoicism have done. The other thing which you said, which I would love to ask a question on, is, because this is so important, when Epictetus is talking about impressions, if we unpack that just a little bit, reality, quote unquote, really doesn't begin to take shape until we as individuals process something in our mind. So in other words, if you and I both look at a tree, that tree does not exist until you and I see the tree, process it, and now it's in our mind. At the same time, looking at that tree could trigger a whole flood of different emotions and meanings for you than it could for me based upon your background. I'd love to talk a little bit more about Epictetus and impressions, because in this there's so much power, because if we really reflect on it and practice it, we can have an enormous say upon reality, quote unquote, and really begin to craft a peaceful and joyous and harmonious life.
Yeah, no, good. He does have a lot more to say about this. And I think he would disagree with your use of reality. I think that he thinks that the tree is really there, and that if we are seeing it under favorable conditions, we are seeing what's really there. The Stoics are pretty commonsensical about these things, actually. They think that when we're born, our minds are blank slates. So we're not born with any concepts or ideas or thoughts in our heads, but that we accumulate concepts by experience. And then once we've got some basic concepts from experience, we can form other concepts, by combining concepts and so on. And they think that it's just in the run of nature that human beings will form a big set of concepts, and indeed the same set of concepts, given, that we have a shared human nature, and given the way the world is, we're all going to have some basic concepts in common. Then, once we have these concepts in our head, those concepts inform our impressions of the world. So we get sensory information from our eyes and our ears and our nose, etc. And that sensory information enters our minds informed by the concept. So that whatever information is in our eye, when it enters the mind, then we suddenly have an impression of a tree. Why? Because we have a concept of the tree that informs this particular bit of information that we now see a tree. And if our circumstances are favorable, then our impression that the tree is going to be true and indeed couldn't be false. So the Stoic will say we have this secure grasp that it's a tree.
Professor, if I just may, one moment, because I think I may have been unclear. I completely agree with that there's no question that there is the tree there, meaning if somebody said, well, walk through this, you can't. What I was trying to articulate is, let's say that I have a horrible memory of crashing my bike into a tree when I was 8 years old, and you have a magnificent memory of being pushed on a swing on a tree. Although the tree is undeniably real, how you and I process it initially may be impacted by that. However, by utilizing Epictetus and understanding that, hey, the tree is just the tree, we're superimposing something else onto it that we do have choice over, back to what you can and can't control. And by making a different choice, we can then experience that differently. That's what I was trying to say. If that,
I think that's right. And so it's like there are differences in the way we see trees. Like if you were just thinking about the simple perception part of this, if you are an expert, you're an arborist, you're an expert about trees, then you're not just going to see a tree, you're going to see a particular eastern pin oak or whatever. Whereas I, ignorant of these finer details, I'm just going to see a tree. Moreover, if you're an expert, you may not only see a tree, but you might see whether that tree is healthy or unhealthy. You're going to see things about that tree that I don't see as a non-expert. And then, as you point out, given that we have different associations with the tree, our recognition of this tree is going to prompt other thoughts in us, right? So, that the vision of a tree that resembles the tree you crashed into might prompt painful thoughts of the crash, whereas my happy swing thoughts might come to mind. Absolutely.
Exactly. And but the best part is by having the awareness between distinguishing the impression versus the reality, so let's just go beyond the tree a little bit, and somebody comes into me and says, hey, Stephen, I think your approach to this sales initiative is completely incorrect. If I'm not self-aware, I might say to myself, how dare this person speak to me this way? And I might have all of these defensive associations, which are completely fictitious. But if I'm aware of that, I can say, hey, wait, all that they're doing is saying that I might need a new approach. Let me reflect on that, process that, see if it makes sense, which is, I think, an extraordinarily important concept that sadly many people don't understand. but yet it's there when he's talking about impressions.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So that if we can learn to see the tree as what it is and not as something that's there to harm us, or for that matter, as something that's there to just straightforwardly, make us happy, then we might have a better relation to the tree in the world. And we're going to have an easier time living smoothly and coherently. If we're constantly experiencing things in relation to this is out to get me or this is out to benefit me, then the world is a complicated and difficult place to navigate. But if we are in a world that is not in this way alternately hostile and in favor, but fundamentally the world is in our favor to the extent that it's well ordered and it's intelligibly ordered, and we can grasp that and we can make our own souls well ordered and intelligibly ordered. And so that we can experience the kind of beautiful life that the whole cosmos has.
I think that's really well said. And it's one of the reasons why I think Stoicism has the popularity it does. And certainly I derive an incredible benefits from it. But it does lead me to another question, which is that when I've listened to other podcasts or read things from professors that are not, I guess, specializing in or focused in Stoicism or ancient philosophy, they mistakenly, in my humble opinion, almost denigrate Stoicism because of its very practicality. And again, I can't speak for all professors, but perhaps you've heard this or perhaps you haven't, but I would love to know your thoughts. That I remember hearing one scholar say, well, meditations really isn't a cohesive philosophy. It's almost like it's almost a book of sayings and suggestions on how to live life, and saying that almost dismissively. But I think that is almost the actual reflection of what Epictetus is critiquing and completely misses the point. I'm wondering if what I've experienced, is that unique in the academy? Have you experienced that, or just some thoughts on that observation?
Yeah, so I think that a couple of critical remarks about Epictetus and Marcus are not unreasonable. So one of them is that neither one of these sets of works is really unified. So we'll read Marcus, it's not clear that it's all carefully organized or unified. There's some repetition. And if you like your works of art to be a whole that's more than the sum of its parts, I think that that's not really the Meditations. The Meditations just is the sum of its parts. But mind you, that's a big sum because the parts are really impressive. So that'd be one criticism that I think is not unreasonable. And then the other thing is, it's true that Marcus and Epictetus are in the business primarily of giving people advice about how to live, and they're not in the business of explaining the whole philosophical system. They do offer some explanations for some of the advice that they give. So it's not like they're just dictating or stipulating. They are philosophizing, but they're not providing the whole rationale, the whole big system. And so some professors are really interested in that whole big system. And so for them, these texts are not as exciting as some other texts. But that's, I think, that one can say, yeah, those are legitimate complaints without saying that anything like these texts are not worthwhile. These texts are fantastic ways into Stoicism, and they are fantastic reminders of many of the Stoic lessons. So they're great texts. If you're really interested in, the whole Stoic system and what it all adds up to, then you need to look at some other texts too, and you need to sort of think about what's lurking behind the background of what Epictetus says and what Marcus says, things that they don't talk about.
Well, I certainly have been doing some reading about the sort of critiques and distinctions between Epicurus and Epictetus. And although I haven't done anything approaching serious work, I'm still always drawn to the Stoics and their sort of approach, because it's also an approach which I think, which I happen to love. I think certain people may have a problem with, or dare I say, might find anti-intellectual, but both Aurelius and Epictetus make it very clear that this is a God-created universe and a universe with order and a universe with morality. And so well beyond business, I think it's an incredibly uplifting philosophy, because unlike nihilism or other ways of looking at things, this puts us in a place where, no, there is a moral world, there is a way to behave, And there are ways that you can operate within this that will bring you joy and peace. Would you say that's a fair impression that I've derived from that?
I think it is. And I think I would just, add two little epicycles to that, basically, clarifications. And one is that their view about the cosmos as divinely created is not created by a separate God, a transcendent God. It's rather created by an immanent God. So God is in the cosmos and forming the order of the cosmos all the time. So the picture is more like the one we get from the 17th century Jewish Dutch philosopher Spinoza. It's not a picture of the book of Genesis, where there's a God that's separate from the world. The other, I think, tweak is that although, yes, the order of the world and the beauty of the world, its intelligibility, it gives us a model that we can live up to. There's a way in which there are norms in the world, but these norms are not separate from us. They are not dictating to us. Rather, we, who have our own desires and needs, can reason about how best to satisfy these desires and needs. And if we reason well, we will be able to see that we can best satisfy our desires and needs by making ourselves as well ordered as the cosmos. So in that way, the cosmos speaks to us. It doesn't speak to us by dictating. It speaks to us by giving us a model to live up to.
And as I was listening to you, Professor, it reminded me of Abraham in the Bible, because what made Abraham special, I would say, or unique, was that it was necessary for him to activate his intellect in order to identify the monotheistic reality that he did uncover. But it wasn't given to him. In one sense, it was top down, but in another sense, it was an understanding come to through an intellectual journey, which I think is philosophical in nature. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think I like that reading. I think that there are definitely passages in the Torah about the kind of personal work that is intellectual and character formation work that make it possible to apprehend certain truths or possible truths about the way the world is. Yes.
Now, something I would love to just get your thoughts on, which I'm totally unfamiliar with, but would love to learn more, and I know it's an area of scholarship that you're involved in, which is cosmopolitanism. If you wouldn't mind, because I would love to know if you could just share a little bit about that. And is that directly related to or derivative of Stoicism, or is that a sort of distinct school of thought?
Good. So the Stoics famously have this saying that the cosmos, the world as a whole, is, as it were, a polis, where a polis is just a city or a political community. And the as it were is there in our sources. It's koine in Greek or quasi in Latin. So the cosmos is, as it were, a polis. So they're comparing the whole cosmos to a city. And then what do they mean by that? Why are they saying that? And I think the answer to that is, well, in part, they mean this. They mean that the real sources of the norms, if you want to locate the norms of right and wrong, they're not just the norms of they're not the norms of your local community, the laws and the conventions of the people that you live next to. Rather, they're the norms of the cosmos. That's the source of right and wrong. Again, I think it's not the source by way of dictation, but it's the source because of the order of the cosmos gives us a model to live up to. And when we do live up to it, then we recognize what the norms for our life are, what really is right, what really is wrong. So that's the first thing that it kind of means. The cosmos is where the norms come from, not our local community. And then the second thing that it means is that it puts all of us in relation to each other. So every human is related to every other human as a potential fellow citizen of this cosmos. If we can live up to the norms of the cosmos, then we are functioning fellow citizens of the cosmos. And that suggests that, we humans as such should care more about each other and maybe less about other people just because they're fellow citizens in the local community. So it's a pretty countercultural challenge to traditional Greek thinking, where traditional Greek thinking will say you owe a lot to fellow Athenians if you're an Athenian, and you don't owe much to non-Athenians. and you owe almost nothing or less than nothing to people who aren't Greek speakers. And then the Stoics come along and they say that might be wrong, but you might owe things to human beings as such, and you might not owe much in particular, if anything, to fellow Athenians. I found that kind of set of views is very interesting. I spent a lot of time trying to think about why would they issue that challenge? How do they try to defend it against the traditional view and so on? But it's one of the features of Stoic thought that's pretty radical.
It's pretty radical, and yet it is in alignment with a lot of Judeo-Christian religious values and values that I think are quite common. A lot of people would be very much in agreement with what you just described and very much in favor of it as not just a moral and an ethical thing to do, but as an appropriate way to really enhance the quality of life on this planet for everybody. Quite actionable and practical, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a thought that has emerged in multiple traditions. And I think often when it emerges, it doesn't emerge unequivocally. So I think that there are passages in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament that call for this kind of cosmopolitanism. And I think there are also passages that call against it, that are more like, these are our people, those are not our people, that draw those kinds of distinctions. And there's always that tension. And I think that as often, living well is a matter of recognizing a certain thing is valuable, but not overvaluing it and not undervaluing it, or a certain principle as holding, but don't see it holding too often or not often enough. And it's just the kind of getting it right is hard.
I have one more question that I must take advantage of and ask you since I have you, because after reading Epictetus, I began reading Plato, and I have read a number of his works. And the dialogue, or if it is a dialogue, Phaedo, in my view, Phaedo is probably the most astonishing and wonderful piece of literature that I've read thus far. It was incredibly moving, and I use the word literature deliberately. And so my question for you, Professor, is when I read that, and of course there's a tremendous amount of philosophical inquiry that is embedded in it. It's incredibly profound. But yet, as a work of literature, it is unbelievably, to me, moving and stimulating and creative and engaging. And at times, I don't want to say overwhelming, but unlike any experience I've had, and as I say, I was a literature major, I read lots of fiction. So my question to you is, in your opinion, is Plato using his ability to craft magnificent literature as an additional rhetorical tool to drive home the philosophical points that are embedded in Phaedo? Or is this just an incidental reflection of his brilliance? Because to me, it's such an outstanding work of literature that it had to be deliberate, and I'm trying to reconcile or understand better in my own mind how this literary aspect of it ties into the philosophical discussion that's embedded within Phaedo.
That's a great question. Plato is awesome. And I think that Plato is in love with Socratic philosophy, with the philosophy that he saw Socrates doing. And it's a great thing, and he wants more people to do it. He doesn't want to tell people what he thinks the best answers are to the questions about how the world is or how to live or about how to go about figuring out such things. He wants merely to depict as vividly as he can this philosophical work of seeing why you should want to pursue philosophy and of trying to do it, of trying to pursue wisdom. He wants to depict that as vividly as he can to provoke people into pursuing wisdom and to taking up the philosophical life. I think his writing is chosen to depict philosophy and stimulate philosophy rather than to record his philosophical answers.
That's a great answer, because it certainly has worked with me ever since I've started. I've been on this journey with philosophy and been loving it, and loving it most importantly as a person. But undeniably, I think that the study of philosophy, and again, I'm very new to this, but we could talk about, I definitely believe that it is continuing to enhance my decision-making and my abilities as a business leader, as a CEO, but certainly has enhanced my appreciation of life and thinking. And oddly enough for me, I'm very happy that I've come to it when I have in life, because I think it's the perfect time to really appreciate it, you know?
Yeah. I think there's something to that. I think sometimes we read a great work of philosophy or a great work of literature, some of which are very philosophical, some of them not super philosophical, but it doesn't really matter, but still a great work of literature. And we sometimes read it too young. We're 16, 17, 18, or 19 or 20. And, 19 to 20-year-olds have their own concerns, and they're often not ready for deep probing reflections on the meaning of it all. But, if you come to middle age, if you're fortunate enough to come to middle age and you have a little leisure, a little time to read those great books again, they hit a little differently.
They really do. Well, Professor, I must say this has been an absolute pleasure for me and for the audience. And for those, in the audience that, I have a very active audience that asks a lot of questions, are very involved in entrepreneurship. I will be putting links to Professor Brown's writings and other stuff. I don't know if you're on social media or if anything, or if there's any sort of way you want to give a shout out to people that are listening. You could certainly do that now.
I've lately been on Blue Sky. I've got off Twitter because I'm not very comfortable with the way in which Twitter is amplifying extreme right-wing views and shutting down other views. And I got off Facebook for kind of similar reasons. I wasn't crazy about the misinformation on Facebook. I still do a little bit of Facebook just to see pictures of the kids of my old friends. But I'm on Blue Sky, and my handle there is sophistuein, which means to play the sophist, the Greek verb. It's SOPHISTEUEIN. That is my handle.
Well, that's wonderful. So, Professor Brown, thank you for this wonderful discussion. It was very valuable, and I just want to wish you an awesome day and an awesome start to the school year.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to chat with you and to see you. And I think it's just always fun to talk with people who are fired up about reading interesting books and sharing the experience of reading those books with others. It's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Professor, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toboroff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.